my talk, and the paper that I want to present for you guys today is entitled, "Can We Have Our Cake and Eat It Too? Liberalization, Economic Growth, and Income Inequality." And just to give you a little bit of background in terms of the motivation for this paper, I don't think it'd be too controversial to state that really over the course of the past 20 to 30 years or so, it's become really common for public intellectuals or politicians to claim that liberalization increases income inequality. And to be honest with you, this idea that liberalization increases income inequality is really a part of a larger debate within the economics discipline, really dating back to at least the 1950s, if not before that basically makes the argument that economic liberalization is a sort of double-edged sword, right? So in other words, in exchange for higher rates of economic growth, economic liberalization also increases income inequality, that you really can't have one without the other, is the basic argument that's put forth. But what's interesting is that, especially as I sort of delved into the empirical literature and as I sort of dug into the peer-reviewed articles and publications that look at the connection between liberalization and inequality, what I found was that actually the evidence is much more mixed than a lot of the statements might lead us to assume. In other words, if you look at the 6 studies that actually look at the connection between liberalization and inequality, and when I say liberalization, I'm not talking necessarily about measures of trade, I'm not talking about measures of FDI, I'm talking about policy decisions, right? Policy measures of liberalization. What you find is that
inequalities within country inequalities.
Yes, sir. Yeah, the Gini coefficient. What you actually find is that although it is the case that for the 6 studies, and I know it's hard to make out here, unfortunately, although it is the case that 4 of the 6 studies actually do find a robust positive link between liberalization and inequality, actually 2 of the studies find the exact opposite, right? That there's a negative association somehow between liberalization and income inequality. And to be fair, some of this variation in the empirical literature is due to the fact that scholars differ in terms of the samples of countries that they study and also the analytic techniques that they use. But by and large, this mixed empirical evidence has gotten economists, really over the course of the past 20 to 30 years or so, to make the claim that, look, when you look at the connection between economic liberalization and inequality, that it's really unclear. That given the fact that there are some studies that find a robust negative association, that this association isn't as clear as many politicians or policymakers might lead you to believe. And furthermore, I would say more importantly, these scholars, really again over the course of the past few decades, are now making the assertion that economic liberalization might actually decrease inequality by increasing economic growth. In other words, the logic here being that given the fact that economic liberalization increases economic growth, and that economic growth in turn decreases income inequality, that there's actually an indirect negative association between these 2 variables. And if you guys sort of think about the logic behind this sort of economic liberalization, economic growth, inequality sort of link, it really sounds familiar, right? It sort of sounds similar to the argument put forth by supply-side economists, right? These sort of trickle-down economists that would like us to believe that somehow that liberal economic policies, well, yes, it'll increase growth and it'll all go to the top 1%, but that somehow eventually it's going to just magically disperse to the rest of us, is the assumption, right, that a lot of these economists are sort of theoretically at least asserting over the past few years. So in light of this inconsistency in the empirical literature, I basically try to answer one important question in this paper. I basically try to answer the question of, are public intellectuals indeed incorrect in their assertion that liberalization expands income inequality? And again, this is a really important question because the implication of this, if indeed conventional wisdom is incorrect, this would mean that deregulation actually allows us to have our cake, i.e. growth, and also allows us to all eat it too. Okay? The policy implications, in other words, are very important when it comes to this theoretical connection. To study this important question, I compile a time series cross-sectional data set of 21 developed economies across the years 1970 to 2010. So in other words, we're talking about country year observations here. And I basically used 2 different statistical techniques to analyze this connection. Right, on the one hand, I utilize fixed effects Praise-Winston regression, which allows me to test the direct connection between liberalization and income inequality. And secondly, I utilize fixed effects 2 states least squares regression, which allows me to answer the question of whether or not liberalization has an indirect association with income inequality, again, through that sort of avenue of economic growth. And I'm not going to go through all of the because probably you can't see it, but I'm not going to go through all of the variables here, but I'd like to concentrate on just the top 3. So my main dependent variable will be income inequality, and as Chris mentioned, this is within country inequality. And this is the Gini coefficient from the Standardized World Income Inequality Database. The second variable of interest then is economic freedom. Now, to be clear, this terminology, economic freedom, is not my own. But this economic freedom index is essentially created by the Fraser Institute, which is like a think tank in Canada. And this is the sort of most used measure of liberalization in the literature. And basically what the Fraser Institute does to create this index is they combine a set of 25 plus variables on things ranging from things like the state's level of involvement in the regulation of finance, the state's involvement in things like wage coordination, et cetera, et cetera. And basically this is a interval ratio variable that ranges from 0 to 10, with higher scores denoting more deregulation, right? So like more liberalization, in other words. And third is my proxy for economic growth. And I actually decided to use GDP per capita as opposed to a running 5-year average of growth. And the reason why is because when you use fixed effects regression in the context of a regression analysis, fixed effects essentially deals with the issue of time invariant variables by mean deviating the data, which basically means in layman's terms that it essentially converts all these variables into a difference model. Right? So by including GDP per capita instead of economic growth, it essentially converts this into a growth model. Okay, so on to the results. So essentially here what I have are the results for my Praise-Winston regressions. And again, this answers the question of whether or not economic freedom or deregulation is directly connected to income inequality. And as you can see, kind of, the first row is the variable economic freedom. And as you can see, regardless of whether I include or exclude the control variables, right, excluded here and included here, economic freedom shares a positive association with income inequality, again, showing us that there's a direct connection between these two variables. In the next set of slides then, essentially here, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but what I essentially do is I try my best to replicate this main model 2 inclusive of the control variables. And I basically replicate these by manipulating the parameters so I could basically perform robustness checks. And again, I don't think you can see this, but essentially what I do in the first 2 set of models is I manipulate the time variable. So in the previous model, I actually include decade indicators for my time measurement. But here in the first model here on the left side, I actually exclude the time measures altogether. And as you can see, that does not change the results. Economic freedom still shares a robust positive association with the dependent variable. In that second model then, what I include is yearly controls for, so in other words, yearly dummies for time, as opposed to decade indicators, and again, that does not change the results. In the next 3 set of specifications, models 5 through 7 here, what I essentially do here is I perform what's referred to as the Hattie procedure. And the Hattie procedure essentially allows me to identify those cases that are the most overly influential, right, in the determination of income inequality. And even when I remove Belgium, Portugal, as well as the United States, regardless of removing these overly influential cases, the connection between economic freedom and income inequality remains. And finally, what I do here in the last 2 set of models is I essentially present lagged dependent variables. So in other words, I measure time at t-1 as well as time at t-2, and again, this does not change the results. In other words, basically what we can conclude, at least from these first 2 set of tables, is that economic freedom or economic liberalization does indeed share a robust positive connection, a direct connection with income inequality. Moving on to the next set of models then. So here you have the 2-stage least squares regression. And I actually want to spend a little bit of time explaining the sort of logistics of what's going on in the 2SLS. So essentially here, we have 3 models, right? But in each one of these models are 2 stages to the regression. Okay, so in other words, in the first stage of the regression, essentially what I'm doing is I'm seeing whether or not economic liberalization increases economic growth, whether there's a positive link in that first stage of the model. And in the second stage, then what I do is I see, controlling for the effect of economic freedom on economic growth, I then see whether or not number one, whether economic freedom has a connection to income inequality, and furthermore, whether or not economic growth has an effect on income inequality. Again, there's two stages in each one of these models. So just to go back, as you can see here, although it seems to be the case that economic freedom shares a positive link with economic growth, right, sort of proving the neoliberal argument that it might be the case that liberalization does indeed increase economic growth, at least in this model. But if you look at the sort of second and third model in this table, as you can see, the inclusion of the control variables actually negates the positive association of economic freedom with economic growth. Okay, so in other words, although there's some evidence indicating that it might be the case that economic freedom increases growth, right, it doesn't necessarily hold true when you include these control variables. In the second stage then, like I mentioned, what I do is I explore whether economic freedom and GDP per capita has an effect on income inequality. And as you can see, economic freedom really across each one of these models, and going back to the previous two tables, economic freedom actually displays a direct positive association with income inequality, right? So in other words, conventional wisdom seems to be true. It seems to be the case that, indeed, liberalization increases income inequality. And furthermore, if you look at the evidence for GDP per capita, it does seem to be the case, actually, that economic growth decreases inequality. It's just that, again, if you go back to the first stage, it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case that economic freedom, right, deregulation, increases economic growth. And just to contextualize these results a bit further, essentially what I do here is I replicate those two SLS models, right, so this right here. I replicate it using structural equation modeling. Okay, and to be fair, structural equation modeling actually doesn't allow for a perfect comparison with 2SLS, but it gets the job done at least visually, right? And it gets us a small indication of some of the effects that might exist between these variables. And as you can see, although it certainly does seem to be the case that economic freedom is a robust positive predictor of the Gini coefficient, and it's significant, nevertheless, although it does seem to be the case that there's a positive correlation between economic freedom and economic growth, as well as a negative connection between economic growth and the Gini coefficient, that connection, that sort of indirect pathway is not significant, right? None of those links are significant. So in conclusion, consistent with conventional wisdom and sort of debunking this view that somehow liberalization decreases